for me, the reason that I went to war was out of a profound ignorance of what that would actually entail. It was out of a profound misunderstanding of why my grandfathers had gone to war in the first place. And driven by a really profound desire to prove myself to myself and prove myself to them.
Yeah.
And it's not what you think it's going to be.
Hello, you're listening to the Jerry Hyde podcast. And why not? You could be forgiven for asking, does the world really need another podcast? The fact is, as long as there's people on this planet, we need to hear them. We need to give them a platform, and we need places where our voices can be heard, perhaps now more so than ever before. As someone who's been dubbed the most dangerous therapist in the world, I've spent over 25 years talking to people, and in all that time, I've never met a boring person. Because when you really get inside them, when you really open up and find out what makes them tick, every single one of them is a unique container for extraordinary experiences, fantastic stories and radical ideas. That's something I can promise you about this show, is that we will always feature incredibly unusual, game-changing, rebellious, convention-shattering and above all else exceptional people. And that's because everyone has the capacity to be that if you take the time to get to know them. And then together, maybe, we can make this the most dangerous podcast in the world. It's one thing to go into battle with a gun in your hand. It's another whole thing to go armed just with a camera. And I've always been a huge admirer of photojournalists and war reporters who will put their lives on the line purely for the purpose of bringing the truth back from these distant war zones to those of us that can't imagine the horrors beyond the kind of John Wayne films that we were raised on. And James Brabazon has put his life on the line time and time again. And, you name a war in the last 30 years and James Brabazon has been there. And there's a raw, naked truth to how he presents his work. He's a prolific filmmaker. He's a talented writer of both fiction and non-fiction, and it was a very, very powerful start to anyone's Saturday to sit and have a conversation with him and share some of our thoughts and bounce some ideas around without any, real objective other than to bring some of his personal experiences and views to you guys who, listen to this show. So, make yourself a cup of tea and sit down. And this is unusual, this one, because he's a very unusual man. So, ladies and gentlemen, James Brabazon. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm all right. Is your week quieting down?
Oh, my goodness. Yesterday was really intense, and I was still at it at like midnight last night. So
intense times, man. But I mean, fuck, you say yesterday was intense. How do you measure intense anymore? I was just laughing, and I shouldn't have been, but actually, I think it's an interesting way in. I was laughing at you describing. Using the phrase, I was just doing a bit of kind of last minute research. But I've read My Friend the Mercenary, and we chatted before a couple of years ago. But I was just doing a little bit of Googling, and there was a article in one of the papers where you used the phrase "the funny thing about a barrel bomb," and I started laughing because it reminded me of the end scene of Carry On Up the Khyber, Do you remember that? Where they're all sitting around in the residency and, the Afghan hordes are coming over the walls and plaster's coming down and they're all chatting as if nothing's happening. And I thought, this is a particularly British way of talking about very traumatic things, isn't it? I mean, we have this amazing ability to laugh and joke about. You even made a joke about the fucking crocodile, which, looks very lucky that you were ever able to have children after that one.
Yeah, indeed. I don't know if my children would say that I was lucky to have children, but anyway, it's a work in progress. There was an occasion when I was, we'll probably cycle back to this, and I will answer your question about how you measure intensity, or at least how I do now. But when I was in the outskirts of Monrovia, Tim Hetherington, we hadn't eaten much or anything for about 3 days. And we've been in the middle of some very intense firefights, which have been going on sporadically for about 48 hours. And we were with the rebel army, and they were on the point of deciding whether they were going to go forward or whether they were going to withdraw. And it turns out that actually they didn't have any ammunition, so they were going to withdraw. And we were being overrun by government troops at that point. But immediately prior to that, it wasn't clear what was going to happen. So the rebels had cooked up a chicken. And this rebel, it's like a equivalent of an NCO, I suppose, had brought me a plate of chicken, and we sat down and we started eating the chicken together. Tim was like running around like a blue-ass fly, actually doing his job, filming what was becoming a rebel retreat. There were government soldiers about 800 yards away from us down the main drag, a lot of rocket-propelled grenades, a lot of AK fire. And I just sat there eating the chicken with this guy on the stoop. And at one point, he looked at me, this rebel looked at me and said, aren't you supposed to be filming this? And I said, yeah, I am, but this is the first chicken I've had in like a month. So we finished the chicken. Priorities. And very narrowly got out of that one. But I think for me now, intensity. So, for example, at Channel 4, I've obviously made a lot of films for Channel 4, and ordinarily I would be overseeing all of their hostile environments deployments. So I look at the plans that producers have, where they're going, and help them construct a viable plan to help them, get out of trouble and try not to get into trouble in the first place. And of course, there's very little foreign filming going on, if any, at the moment. So instead of doing that, I've been helping with the channel's COVID response, trying to get productions safe, compliant, able to keep filming. So intensity for me at the moment is if you've got a multi-million-pound production with a lot of people who've all been tested, working in close proximity to each other, and then there is a COVID incident. It's working very hard to make sure that affects as few people as possible, primarily for the sake of their health, but also so that the production can keep going, and everyone whose livelihood is dependent upon that production keep going, has an income. So, rather than it being something which is just specifically about myself and, how am I going to get out of here and will I have eaten the chicken? It's now about the livelihoods of a lot of people that, everyone is trying very hard to safeguard while making TV programs that I would not ordinarily have made. Bake Off, First Dates, The Circle were not like my stock in trade. As a camera operator, but there's a lot of people like them, and there are a lot of people, at the end of the day, pay their mortgage and feed their kids off the back of them. So that's good enough for me.
But it says there's a somewhat, I'm a shrink, right? So I look at things in a certain way, and there's a somewhat, to me, throwaway comment, I think, on your Wikipedia page that says that you recovered from PTSD, and I'm always suspicious about that that word and what it means, and I'd be interested what that means to you. But I guess for me, recovery is not, you can't erase history, but it's something that's not disabling you. And for me, that ability to go into intensity where other people probably can't is probably, again, recovery is not the right word, but you can, right? You're trained to tolerate a certain level. Like I'm trained to sit and listen to a certain level of shit that most people go, oh God, I don't want to hear that. I'm wary of making comparisons because our worlds are very different, but there are certain areas where I think I have to try and relate to you, because otherwise how the fuck is anyone ever going to have a relationship with you? Because very few people in the West certainly are going to be able to relate to you. And that's something that Sebastian Junger talks about in War, I think, where he comments on, I think, Israel having the lowest levels of PTSD in the world because they're not alone. They're not going away and then coming back to something where they can't relate to anyone. But there's a lot of questions in that.
Yeah, there are. Yeah. Remind me to come back to the Israel question at the end, actually, because that's fascinating. I have thoughts about that as well. So yeah, I'll have to make sure my Wikipedia page is edited, because that's not written by me. I haven't recovered from PTSD because I didn't have PTSD.
Right.
At least there were no formal diagnosis of PTSD. Yeah. I had a very strong post-traumatic stress reaction, and I had counselling when I came back from my first long trip to Liberia. And
I think a lot of people would need counselling after they read that fucking book, man. Sorry to interrupt, but it was, it's not like reading, is it?
It's not like reading.
Was that therapeutic though? Was that part of your own personal kind of getting it out, to write it out? This is my friend.
Yeah, I mean, the counselling I had, which was like very sort of traditional trauma counselling. I had it at the Priory with a very good trauma counsellor who did a lot of work with the armed forces. And that was a revelation and really, really helpful for me personally. Therapy comes in many forms. And I think as long as you aren't avoiding issues and therefore potentially making them worse, as long as you can accept that there may be things that you need to consider, so I hate to use the expression work on, but to think about how your experiences have formed you and continue to form you as a person and what that might mean, then I think that's important. That's all part of the process. And writing the book was part of the process for me. On the one hand, I wanted to write down what had happened, just accurately and truthfully. These are the things which happened to me and the people that I was with, some of whom I loved and some of whom I didn't. And it was also important because I was very close to a lot of people who were engaged in very morally dubious activity. And especially in the case of the mercenary Nick DeToy, who's a close personal friend, perhaps it was something that was just in my own mind. Perhaps it was something that was real. There was a constant suspicion that I wasn't really doing my job as a journalist, because fundamentally I was protecting my friend and not really saying what the truth was. And that came to a head, or the truth as I perceived it. And that came to a head when I was making the film, My Friend the Mercenary, for Channel 4. And there were things, at that time, Nick DeToy was on trial for his life in Equatorial Guinea because of his involvement in the coup attempt. And there were things which I knew that I just didn't want to say because it would have incriminated him and he could have faced a death penalty as a result. And extraordinarily enough, I was criticized I found it extraordinary. I still find it extraordinary. I was criticised for that, even though I'd made it very clear that there were some things I just couldn't do or say because I didn't want to be responsible for the death of my close friend. And after a few years had elapsed, I started writing the book 5 years after Nick had been jailed. It was possible for me to start to tell more of the whole truth. Mm. And then once he was released while I was writing the book, and then I could be very open indeed. Mm. So it was an exercise in journalistic credibility. But it was partly because I wanted to write these things down for my children in the future. And partly because, memory is unreliable. And of course, I didn't know at the time that Tim Hetherington would be killed fairly soon after I wrote the book. But the two of us spent a lot of time talking and correcting each other's false memories of what had happened. Mm. Like some events which we both shared, we both had very different memories of. And piecing together from our diaries and from the footage that we shot, we managed to put together a very accurate representation of what those trips actually amounted to. And perhaps that's just the compulsion to do that is fundamentally egotistical. I don't know. The idea that journalism is the first draft of history was absolutely true. And I think that perhaps in time to come, that whole side of the conflict, and we were the only people that covered it, actually at all. So it seemed to me important that there was a sort of a straightforward, factual record of my experiences insofar as they might help other people who later came to try and understand it. Plus, I just love telling a good yarn. So,
But I guess, just continuing with the self-therapy thing, I came to discover you and your work through your, to me, amazing, beautiful tribute to Tim, Which Way's the Front Line from Here. And I'm speculating that was obviously part of the self-recovery, or again, ambiguous about that word, but therapy from his loss. It's such a poignant tribute. But it's not sentimental, which is I think I said that to Sebastian. That's a fucking narrow line, and you trod it amazingly well.
It was a very difficult line to tread. I hope that we got it right. It's encouraging that you and other people think that we did. Again, I think what we tried very hard not to do was to create a hagiography. And there are a lot of people, at the time particularly, but still even now, almost kind of venerate Tim as some kind of a saint. And I'm here to tell you that he wasn't, and he'd be appalled by the idea. There's a lot of, and still is a lot of nonsense even around the things that he owned. The cameras that he owned, the clothing that he wore, as if owning them or touching them brings you nearer to this person. And that just seemed to me to be spectacular bullshit. And I didn't want any part of that. What I did want to do was participate in something that would show how Tim made the work that he did and why he did it and how it affected him, and consequently how he affected the world. And I think it's a true reflection. And there's some stuff that's just pointless to speculate on. It's pointless to speculate on why he went out that day. It's pointless to speculate on, you know, if people had done things differently, could he have survived? You know, those are, if he'd done things differently, would he still be here? He's not.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's you drive yourself mad thinking about that.
Well, in the end, the fact you're here, he's not. I was talking with Tim Page, the Vietnam photographer, a while ago, you know, and the amount of people that were associated with him that aren't here, it's luck, isn't it? You can't explain it beyond that. You can get into all sorts of speculation. But the bottom line, fuck knows.
Yeah, I mean, every single act has behind it so many other composite acts. And, you know, down to one Libyan gunner getting lucky that day and sighting his round in the right place. I mean, you know, if he had an argument with his wife or his, you know, partner the night before, maybe his aim would have been off. I mean, it's like, there's a point at which in Liberia, I mean, the two of us, and particularly the first trip that I went on, the long trip I did just with me and Nick, there's a point at which survival is just a statistical aberration. And you can't train for it. You can't plan for it. The only way you can avoid it is just to not be there. So that's the decision is really, do you go? And then a much less discussed decision is, do you go back again? And I think that you know, I mean, I've talked about this before, but there are a lot of very obvious reasons why men in particular go to war. It's less obvious, unless they're being compelled to do so, why they stay at war. But the real question for me is why people go back. You know, it's like, why do you do your second parachute jump? Because you know what it's going to be like the second time round. And that's, for me, is the key, is understanding that dynamic. And Tim kept going back. And if you go back, you accept those statistical variations. You know, does the bullet pass an inch to the left or an inch to the right? You can't control it other than by removing yourself from the environment entirely or choosing not to go there in the first place. So it is true, to a degree, people do make their own luck. You carry the right med kit, you have the right med training, you have a basic understanding of what's happening in combat. But you can't do anything about the other guy's aim.
But, you know, I'm as guilty as anyone as to, you know, speculating what took Tim out that day, what took you out, any of the days you went, any of the people I've read about or been interested in. I think it's what I referred to earlier about trying to relate to you, even though your experiences are very different. I try and put it in my own kind of reference system. And as someone with a history of addiction, that's how I understand it, because there's few drugs more powerful than adrenaline. And I can't think of a more adrenalized situation than some of the ones you've chosen repeatedly to go back into. And it doesn't puzzle me when you talk about sitting and eating chicken during a battle. That's something that I can somehow I understand that, because I put myself in some pretty fucking out there things for a civilian. It's usually when I feel at my calmest, and it's not till later and I look back and go, what were we up to? You know, sailing incidents and some of the kind of wilderness retreats out. I went up to the Tarkine rainforest and we got hit by a cyclone and there's fucking eucalyptus trees coming down and shit like that. And in the heat of it, I'm as cool as a cucumber and I feel more alive. That, you know, I watched, did you see Free Solo, the Alex Honnold film?
No, I haven't watched that yet. It's on the list.
Oh, I had to prep myself for that one. But I get it. I mean, he's also got part of his brain missing, which means he doesn't really experience fear, which helps enormously. But I get that sense of aliveness that I think is
through our ritualized habitual behaviors is denied to your average civilian until a heightened moment. And you know, we've all read thousands of accounts of people in a terrorist attack or a car crash who go, in that moment I felt alive. So that's where I've gone in my kind of speculative mind. And it must be an incredibly hard. I look at your photos of the sea, which are mind-blowingly beautiful, and you know, on Instagram that you post regularly nowadays. You seem to have suddenly appeared on Instagram, which is lovely. But I don't know how you go from one to the other. And what's interesting about your photos, sorry, I'm going to ping all over the place because it's how my brain works. They kind of remind me in not stylistically, but in their quality of some of Don McCullen's landscapes, which to me are all war photographs. That guy cannot look at the world. I mean, he will take a picture of Somerset, you know, the most idyllic kind of Enid Blyton scenario, and it just looks like something out of Tolkien. You know, it's an incredibly powerful, visceral photo of a man who's been through those kind of things. And your photos of the sea have that force in them. They're not pretty pictures. They're beautiful, but they're not pretty.
Thank you. Being compared to Don on any day makes it a good day. I'm reluctant to use the word addiction for what I did, because it implies, I think, a lack of implies a degree of compulsion and a lack of control. And I made conscious decisions to do what I was doing. Retreating to the sea. I've lived by the sea for years, and it's been a part of my life since I was a very small child. And I've always taken photographs. I mean, I started off as a stills photographer, you know, and I started shooting properly when I was about 15, 16. Shooting my own black and white, developing it, printing it. That was really my route into this world in the first place. So it feels like I've kind of gone back to first principles, really. And I think that's a sort of period of retrenchment. And, you know, in Islam, I'm very interested in the idea of before jihad, in however you are going to interpret that, whether it's a physical military jihad or an internal spiritual struggle. There's that period, first of all, of retreat and contemplation, of hijrah. And the idea of you consolidate, consider before you set out on the venture. Very similar in the same way to the Christian idea of fasting before a spiritual, you know, endeavor. Before the apostles went out into the world, they had a period of fasting. And I think that the sea photographs and the sort of interacting with nature are it's a kind of retreat for me. You know, I'm not going out to war zones anymore. I never made a conscious decision to stop doing that. And I was very fortunate to be able to start writing fiction for Penguin. That's been great. And Channel 4 have been really good to me, and I keep working for them. But, you know, I feel there's a hinge moment of what happens next, you know. And see, it's very good to have a horizon which is both simultaneously constant and always changing. And it doesn't matter. I can walk down to the same spot of the beach. You know, I'm taking these photographs, by the way, my range is about 300 yards. They're all taken in the same place, and I look at them and, you know, by and large, they're all different. It's very hard to walk down to the beach and stand in the same spot and take the same photograph twice, especially not on the English Channel. So, you know, there's a degree there of contemplation, I suppose. But it's interesting what you were saying about Sebastian's thoughts about and research about Israel and PTSD. I think that potentially, I don't want to speak out of turn here because this is something I know, but it's a thought, is that I think one of the things about coming back from conflict in the West is that even in societies which are, you know, have the sort of the US mentality of thank you for your service, you know, letting uniformed personnel onto the plane first, you know, uniformed personnel regularly being clapped in public. Your endeavor as a soldier in the West is not something which is going to be either shared by the majority or even a substantial minority of the population anymore. And B, isn't something which is necessarily going to be agreed as a good thing by a majority or even a substantial minority of the population. You know, it's one thing to say, oh, well, you know, we support the troops even if we don't support the war. But it's very hard to have a meaningful conversation with a veteran if they know full well that you really did not agree with the shape, form or substance of what it was that they were doing and why they were doing it. And I think possibly in Israel there is a difference there, that it's, you know, there is a collective military experience of an entire nation, vast areas of which are within range of enemy rocket fire. So whether you're a civilian or a soldier, you're living under a certain degree of threat. And however controversial internally Israel's military activity might be, I suspect but don't know, there is a greater feeling of cohesion around those military acts than there is in, say, England Britain over the Iraq War or over our involvement in Afghanistan or whatever. So I think perhaps going back to relatability, it's a tricky one really, and I don't want to put everyone who's experienced combat into the same circle in the Venn diagram, because they're not. And I've sought out in my personal life other journalists, soldiers, operators who it's very easy to talk to. There's a shorthand. You don't have to explain certain things because we've all experienced them to one degree or another, and we know what they are. And that's a lot of where the dark humor comes in, because everyone knows in that group of people what the reality is. Everyone knows what it's like to see your friends hurt, get killed. Everyone knows what it's like to experience that. You have to talk about that, but you can make illusion through a kind of shared shorthand, which means you can actually have normal conversations which are helpful and meaningful, rather than always having to revisit the details of the horror. None of my mates who've been in combat have ever asked me, what's the worst thing that you ever saw? What's the worst thing that happened? When were you most afraid? That conversation doesn't happen. And there might be a specific incident that when it gets really late at night and you've had a few drinks, you might start exploring. But I think people have to be also very cautious that they don't only select the people that they speak to and are friends with on the basis of whether they've been to war or not, because that would make for A, very dull dinner conversation, and B, it's just not healthy, you know. And I think there is a division. There's just a very clear division.
Division's the word that was in my mind. Did you ever see? It seems to have vanished off YouTube, or I've forgotten what link it was. But there was an amazing film by an anthropologist shot in Papua New Guinea in 1963 of a battle between two tribes. Did you ever see that? It's like a kind of, it's a bit like a kick around on the local village green, because all the kind of, it's a while since I saw it, but as I remember it, all the kind of women and kids and the old people come out with a picnic and they sit up on the hill, and the two tribes kick off down below, and the rules are that the war continues until one person is killed, and then it's whatever insult has been dealt with and pride, and honour's been preserved. And they kind of, there's a lot of posturing and kind of throwing of pointy sticks and little rudimentary bows and arrows and stuff, and eventually somewhere around tea time, one of the warriors gets an arrow in his shoulder and it's a bit hurty, and they pull it out and they go, "Oh fuck it, that will do then," and everyone goes home. But you can see the origins of the arena or gladiators or anything, football even, and it's everyone's together in it. And I guess they go home and go, "Well, did you see that minute when blah blah blah?" It's not split, and it's relatively recent in my mind, by which I mean in the last 1,000 years, that people have gone off on crusades or campaigns overseas. Mm-hmm. Prior to that, I guess warfare is something that's been a pretty local affair between people and shared.
It's become, I suppose, both professionalized, and also, removed from the home theatre. It was in the Second World War. Both of my grandfathers had various experiences, but so did my grandmothers.
Yeah.
They both of them lived through intense Axis bombing during the war.
Yeah, my grandmother talked about, she lived out in Buckinghamshire, so like 30 miles west of London. She remembers the windows rattling during the First World War from the Western Front. So
yeah. So it seems very much, sort of joint enterprise, really. Everyone suffered, and for a very identifiable reason. And when you have people that have come back from somewhere that's far away, no one's really quite sure where it is or why they were there in the first place. And that makes relatability much more difficult. From a personal point of view, I really strongly feel and see, there is a difference between, you've either been to war or you haven't. You've either been in combat or you haven't. There isn't a bridge. And I think the trick is not to see that as defining your social interactions, because there are lots of other divisions and there are lots of other experiences that aren't bridged directly, but there is one overarching bridge of a common humanity, which is more important. And I find it, sometimes I find it very difficult talking to young men who haven't experienced those extremes. I find it's very difficult to find a point of contact.
But this touches, we spoke a couple of years ago, I think, briefly on the phone when I was trying to write a book that I didn't know what it was about, and ultimately it changed shape completely. But it was, in many ways, I think it was your grandfather that almost prompted that book, because I run a lot of, I do a lot of men's work. I run a lot of men's groups, and this statement that you quoted of him saying of his experience in Burma, I believe, that war is the only place where men can experience unconditional love for each other without judgment. I can't remember the exact wording, but that was more or less the essence of it, I think. that triggered a lot of things in me. And what you're saying about, again, this division, it kind of made an old, quite deep and profound question flare up in me, even though I was already well into my 50s by then, which is, can you, in a world where we more or less no longer have any kind of formalized rites of passage, are you legitimate if you haven't been to war?
This is a really important question, and it goes to the heart of a lot of issues, and I think problems in society.
Well, yeah, I live in an area that's rife with like gang warfare and knife crime, for example.
It's very hard if society. I mean, it's very careful about looking backwards to say, well, you see, people did this once upon a time, and there must have been a reason why they did it. And the fact that we don't do it anymore is a bad thing, and that's the cause of the problems. Because people also, burned women at the stake for being witches, and so you have to be really, really careful about extrapolating ancient practices which no longer exist into the modern environment.
I've read about enough rites of passage rituals to think I'm quite glad not to have dodged that one.
Exactly. So, however, there still does remain this fundamental problem for men. And maybe it's just a problem that has always existed, and we've tried various different ways as a society to resolve this problem. Maybe there has not yet been an answer. But it's the age-old question of when a man knows that he is a man and is no longer a boy. And is that something which is realized internally, or is it something which is imposed externally? And what are the implications of that realization or imposition? And, for me, the reason that I went to war was out of a profound ignorance of what that would actually entail. It was out of a profound misunderstanding of why my grandfathers had gone to war in the first place, and driven by a really profound desire to prove myself to myself and prove myself to them.
Yeah.
And it's not what you think it's going to be. It really isn't. And like my mum's dad, like when I came back from Liberia, unlike my dad's dad, who was in Burma, he talks a lot about the war. My mum's dad was in the desert, Western Desert in Italy, spoke very little about the war. And he and I, our relationship just like overnight. Yeah, it was an extraordinary thing. It was just like the level, complexity and depth of our friendship evolved almost instantaneously. Just like, now you know. And he could talk to me in the last, couple of years of his life in a way about his war that he'd never had done before.
I'm thinking, if you had a son and he went to war, that would be would be his privilege to go with that naivety or innocence, but you'd be presumably terrified for him. Did your grandfather express having to manage a lot of concern about knowing what you were walking into in a way that you didn't?
No, he didn't. But he did talk about the fear of when he was there, and which he never had done before.
Mm.
Yeah, he was very honest about it. And, you know, I think the thing that both of my grandfathers, I mean, like my dad's dad, Martin, in Burma, had the definition of an intense war. I mean, it didn't get much worse than the Burma campaign.
Mm.
And, I mean, both of them lost basically all of their friends. They were the only almost, and my grandfather, one guy he was very close to in the desert. Apart from that, they lost everyone. And the inconvenient truth always rears its head. Both of them, at times, had an absolute blast, an absolute whale of time.
Mm.
And, you know, as did Tim and I. Tim was very open about it, you know, and it is that inconvenient truth is that sometimes war can be fun. And, you know, I've shouted at actually literally shouted at by someone once for saying that publicly. And war is not fun. And if you don't understand that it is, then you'll never stop it. You'll never change it. Unless you can grapple with the fundamental basics of why men fight, what the experience as a totality means. If your ambition is to limit, stop, or change why, how, or when we fight, you'll never do it unless you understand that basic psychology. I mean,
again, I think Sebastian talked about that in one of his TED talks. I think it was he said, you know, hands. Again, I think I'm remembering this slightly incorrectly, but it was something along the lines of, you know, hands up who considers themselves a pacifist, and then hands up who's ever been to see a war film for entertainment. You know, played a video game or whatever.
Mm.
And I've never read a book that I've considered credible, and I've read a lot of books. I'm not very big on history books, but first-hand accounts, veterans accounts. I've got shelves and shelves of. I don't think I've ever read one that doesn't touch on what you're saying. You know, this for many people, this was the best time of my life. You know, sitting in a shell hole or sitting in a trench somewhere on the Western Front, with all these deprivations and rats and dead bodies and stuff. But again, it comes back to your grandfather's thing of it's that intimacy that I think civilian day-to-day British society doesn't really encourage.
No,
facilitate.
It does.
No.
It doesn't facilitate it or encourage it. And
I think that's as important as what you're saying about it being fun, that also men crave that closeness. And where else can you find it and have permission to really love someone that wholeheartedly without being called gay or some kind of stupid playground disparaging comment? And I think, again, as an outsider, it seems that a lot of those rules just crumble away when you're in that kind of intensity. And people talking about, well, I'd get a box of fags or a cake or something from home. And of course, the first thing we did was share it with our mates. And something breaks down in that, it seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of, again, it's a joint effort. It's a corporate enterprise, you know. I mean, and that can generate quite complicated moral questions as well. You know, I would sit down with rebel commanders who would share with me the last of their rice rations. We had almost nothing to eat at the end.
Your famous rice
As it was,
pudding.
Yeah, man, that rice pudding was the best thing I honestly have ever eaten. Just stuff, bits and pieces, the last cigarette, someone's found a couple of some tobacco that you can roll up into a rollie or whatever. It's just there was nothing, we had nothing, and everyone shared what they had. And you sit around a fire, chatting about girlfriends or, what you were going to do after the war, or when you went back home, what it was going to be like. And then in the morning, they go shoot the prisoners. He'd be like, I really like this guy. We had a great conversation last night. And now he's, I filmed him committing a war crime, never mind anything else. It's this very difficult realization to come to terms with, that the people who do bad things are not caricature villains.
Yeah.
They aren't, war movie Nazis.
Mm.
They're just people.
Mm.
And they're much more like you than they are unlike you.
Mm.
That's the real horror.
That's uncomfortable, isn't it? Yeah.
It's the uncomfortable thing. You strip away, like the sort of British tabloid representation of the bloodthirsty African rebel. It's easy to portray someone as different when the color of their skin is different. They're wearing a crazy headdress. They're waving juju charms in the air. When you're up close and personal, it's just a bloke.
Mm. In a dress.
Just a bloke who just looks like you, and fundamentally you strip away the architecture of war and it's just, just a bloke. And it doesn't take much for the mask to slip. You take someone like Sierra Leone, that was a vibrant, functioning democracy. One of the amazing tradition of journalism, of printing and publishing, of the free press. There's a beacon of light and life in West Africa, and that unravelled not quite overnight, but very, very quickly indeed. And not because those people are somehow different to us. It's because they're people. And we are all capable of, with the least encouragement, of fucking ourselves in the arse. And we just do it over and over again. And the idea that it's just this separate group of people will do that is wrong, So I think that comes, it was all coming back to relatability. It's not wrong or perverse that you can have really heart-to-heart meaningful conversations with murderers. It's what you do with that knowledge, what your obligations are a different matter. But it's not surprising that two human beings can have a meaningful conversation with each other. I mean, my grandfather in Burma, Martin, when they took Japanese prisoners, he would share his rice rations with them. Mm. And they had precious little food. And he absolutely insisted that his men obeyed the Geneva Convention. I mean, some of the guys under his command would just have shot them all. And they tried very, very hard to make sure that once prisoners had surrendered, they were treated humanely, even if they subsequently kept trying to kill their British captors. I mean, it was a struggle. I think I took a lot from how he behaved. He was a very contradictory man in a lot of ways. Very fair, but very violent as well. I mean, he was a killer. So no two ways about that.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, go on.
So on the one hand, he would make sure that Japanese prisoners of war were treated properly.
Mm.
On the other hand, he and a group of other officers executed their own commanding officer in the field.
Mm.
Because his arrogance and unconscionable brutality was costing the lives of dozens of their own men.
Mm.
So, I mean, that's got to be probably the most profound dichotomy you can come across. I asked my other grandfather, Don, in the desert. I asked him what he thought of. He met Rommel briefly, and I said, "What did you make of Rommel?" He said, "Well, to tell you the truth, we respected him more than our own commanders." I asked him why I hadn't shot him. He said, "No. Much better to be fighting a professional than, some swivel-eyed ideologue." Sorry, we interrupted each other.
Yeah, no. I mean, again, like I said, I kind of keep going off on tangents because there's so much in this for me. I mean, you talking about your grandfathers losing their mates, and that was something that my grandfather, I remember him breaking down on his deathbed. And interestingly, he seemed to time it when the women were out the room and it was just me and him breaking down. And that was, I don't know if I'd seen him cry before.
Mm.
He was a soft, gentle, very, very loving man, and we were very close, but he hadn't gone there before. And I was like, "What's up?" And he said, "Why did I get 65 years more than my mates?" And that really hurt, that he'd been alone in that for so long. I had no idea that he had any kind of survivor's guilt. It just wasn't something that we touched on. And round about that time, maybe a few years before, I'd persuaded my girlfriend at the time to take a diversion on the way back from holiday and drive through the Somme. And I think I had a breakdown of sorts. I certainly came home and was inconsolable for weeks, and it took years to kind of work through that. And for me, and I kept going back there. I stopped off on the way this summer and had a little walk around some trenches and in some woods and what have you. It's still something that obsesses me, and I know that it's fucking mad. I'm looking for the people who fought there. I'm looking to connect and bond and be part of that stuff I've heard about from my grandfather and read about in books about the camaraderie. I think I feel the absence have felt the absence in my life, and it's touching on a very profound thing, even though I know it finished over 100 years ago and I wouldn't fit in anyway,
Yes, there's nothing quite as frustrating and enticing as the extremely recent past. Almost within reach, but not quite. I was very fortunate. I, had all my grandparents, multiple great-grandparents, a great-great aunt. I mean, like the works, right? And one of my great-grandmothers, she died when I was 9. She was born in 1889.
Yeah.
She was quite involved in my upbringing. I mean, I was, as a small child, basically brought up by a living, breathing Victorian.
Yeah, I say this to
Victorian
people,
values.
I say this to clients of mine when they're talking about, well, it's a long time ago. I've got photos on the mantelpiece here of going back to people who were alive in the 1840s. And I knew some of the people in the photos, like the younger people. So I've met people who knew people in the 1840s, and it shows you what feels like ancient history. I mean, I know people who were probably alive at the same time as Napoleon. It ain't that long ago, and in terms of have the ripple effects. And all of my work, whenever anyone walks in the room, I always ask them about their great-great-grandparents, because I say, well, there's at least 30 or 40 people coming in this room, and most of that is shit that they couldn't talk about, that you don't even know that you're carrying. And I think that's what drew me to you, like I say, that statement by your grandfather, but then the tangible love that you shared with your grandfathers, because that was very much my experience. But at the same time, I'm trying to keep my own train of thought. There's something I didn't say earlier because I thought that's just too naff and too crass, but I'm going to say it because of that. You paused and you looked visibly touched, and you said something like nothing prepares you for it. You know, that first experience of war. And what I censored in myself, because it was so naff, was I remember going on my own to see Saving Private Ryan, and that opening scene was the moment where I thought, oh, I think I changed my mind at this point. Because it was the first time in a film I'd really seen something that, by all veterans' accounts, was very accurate. I would be wanting to get back on the boat. I would not be a hero. It was that moment where I thought I wouldn't be a hero. That would not happen. Whatever a hero is, I mean, that's up for a whole podcast discussion in itself. But the other thing that struck me as you were talking was, and we're talking about division, and I think I have felt that division, and I envy you that, you know, I'm very moved by that connection that you had with your grandfather once you came back from war. I never had that. Excuse me. But at the same time, it's a double-edged thing, because I used to work with violent offenders when I started out, and I remember walking up Hammersmith High Street after a few years of doing this and realising that everyone that reached for their wallet or their phone, I thought they were pulling a knife or a gun, and I thought, I think I've been doing this too long. And there are things that I had to go through in terms of working with murderers and reading autopsy reports and stuff that are in me forever. And I'm rather glad I don't have some of your experiences that you've written about, you know, particularly some of the, like you say, that I totally, utterly buy what you're saying. When it comes down to it, it's just a bloke. And there's obviously colonialism and racism and all sorts of layers of shit in there. And I really would say that's the backbone of my work, is if you want to do some real therapy and you really want to become, I can see it from here. I've painted one of my walls with blackboard paint, and up in the corner I've written a Jung quote which says, do you want to be good or whole? And that's kind of the backbone of my work. Really? You want to sort your shit out? Okay, we've got to find out what complete cunt you can be. You know, because we all can be, and we all have that within us, and we're all beautiful, lovely, nice people as well. But if you want to be a whole person, you got to go to those dark corners, and you've obviously done it in a real sense. But I think the thing that freaked me out in your book most of all was the kind of ritualized cannibalism that you described. That I can understand it in a kind of, you know, I mean, that's mental, man. When you start mixing in kind of voodoo type stuff and warfare and wedding dresses, and it's hard to relate to, right? And I'm rather glad I don't have to live with that in my head. I do now, thanks to you, vicariously, because it was so vivid. But that was a difficult read, you know. And I think because you humanized him, he wasn't the enemy. You humanized him. That's what was so skillful and so difficult about reading that. If it had just been the enemy, they killed the enemy and ate blah, blah. I think I could have passed through it easier, but you didn't make it easy. Well done.
Yeah, well, I mean, it wasn't easy. It's, it's hard enough seeing things, you know, without having a connection to the person when someone's, you know, interacted with you personally. It's harder. I mean, I think understanding the internal logic and rationale of why people do things, like why they're wearing wedding dresses, why they do certain things, is helpful, because it makes it, at least there's some kind of inroad into it. But it's funny, you know, you never know the things that will end up affecting you most. It's all there in my head, but, you know, you film someone having their head cut off, someone, you know, eating someone else. it obviously stays with you, but they're not the worst things. They're not the things that wake me up at night.
Yeah, I found myself weeping watching that beautiful Don McCullen documentary when he talked about the albino Biafran kid that he gave a barley sugar to, and out of all the horrors that he witnessed and he described, that was the one where I felt him struggling the most to manage that. So, yeah.
You never know. You got, and that's the thing. While you're doing it, there's a sort of a degree of editing that happens at the time. If you have any sense of self, you review what you've seen during the day. You think about it. It's like digesting a heavy meal, and you wonder, like, is this the thing that's going to make me sick?
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, it was stuff that seemed almost trivial. Those are the things that stay with you. And I think, that I try hard not to dwell on them. But like you're saying about sort of like reacting to people reaching for their wallets. I mean, I spent a lot of time being, hypervigilance is a problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is a problem. And you can't be like at red all day, every day, because you would go mad. And that's not healthy. I spent a lot of time being very careful where I sat in a restaurant or in a pub, making sure I knew where the exits were, where the windows were. I would, because it's not just Liberia. I've spent my whole professional life at war. Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Colombia, Eastern India, Northern Ireland, Kashmir, Eritrea. I mean, pretty much all of them, right? The Balkans. So, there was a lot of habitual scanning of skylines and thinking, right, well, if the bomb goes off there, who's most likely to get injured? How would I give help? What kit have I got with me? What can I improvise with? What's around here that I can use? And I still have that to an extent. Every now and again, it will still cross my mind, but much less so than it used to.
Did becoming a father, did that change your decision making as to where you would put yourself? Because I mean, again, silly little comparisons, but I decided very quickly I'm not going to ride a motorbike once I became a dad. My kind of risk taking diminished.
For me, it didn't have any impact on it at all.
Right.
And maybe that is indicative of a deep level of psychological disturbance in and of itself. But I did some of the riskiest things I've done after I had children.
Wow.
And after Tim was killed.
Wow.
Now, I mean, never say never, but I have a very different kind of life now. And I think I would struggle to explain to my children why I was now choosing to go and do this again.
Yeah, I mean, it's not my role to analyze you in any way, but I'll tell you what, the two, there's quite a few clients over the kind of 25 years or so I've been working. There's two that freaked me out because I could look in their eyes and see they were never coming back. They'd gone to a place that I didn't want to go to and they were never coming back. And that one was a Portuguese mercenary, one was a British mercenary. They liked it. They got a taste for it and they wanted to keep going. And there was no way I could help them. And that zone they'd gone to frightened me. You don't have that to me. I don't experience that as we talk. You know, you seem to be a man who's very much in charge of himself and on top of whatever demons you may have collected along the way. But, you know, I think that degree of self-knowledge that comes off you, doesn't ring any alarm bells for me.
Well, that's a win for a Saturday morning.
and I just noticed the time, man. I didn't even notice it. I could talk to you all day, so I don't want to keep you too long. But I just want to, just in terms of wrapping up, we haven't even talked about your career as a novelist. I know you've got a new book out, so we should definitely plug that. And just, I'd be interested to hear just 5 minutes on what took you into. Not that I actually believe there is such a thing as fiction, and you'll know what I mean when I say that, but what took you into that, and what do you get from that as opposed to going and doing the real stuff?
It's funny, you know. I totally agree with you. There's no such thing as fiction. And I had mistakenly thought when I started to write fiction that I would be able to make things up, and that I would be liberated from the journalist credo of, you know, always having to tell the truth. And actually, of course, journalism and fiction are, as is every human endeavor, fundamentally subjective.
Yeah, and it's like you're saying with Tim, there's no such thing as fiction. There's also no such thing as the truth, is there?
Yeah, right. Yeah, what is the truth?
Yeah. As
I believe someone else once said, and then washed his hands. You know, for me, the key about reporting let's just take this back to war reporting for a moment. There's a lot of bullshit that's spoken about objectivity in war reporting. I mean, objectivity in reporting full stop, but, you know, my experiences of war reporting. You know, you have to be objective as a war reporter. And it's absolutely impossible, for a start. And it's the wrong question. If you work in conflict, there is a moment at which you will inevitably have to act in the interest of your own survival. You will exercise your own natural and inalienable right of self-defense in whatever form that takes. And as soon as you act in self-defense in a conflict, you're no longer an observer, you're a participant. And participants can't be objective. But what they can be is authentic, and they can be credible. So I ditched the idea of objectivity a long time ago as an unhelpful albatross. Let that bird fly free. For me, it's credibility and authenticity. And that is the same thing that drives what I write fiction. You know, it's like I want the psychological truth of what I'm writing to be authentic. I want the audience who reads this book, whether they're, you know, a 16-year-old in Missouri or, you know, an 80-year-old veteran in Brent, to take away from it something which is compelling and true. And one of the reasons I started writing fiction, apart from the fact that, you know, I grew up with a family of storytellers. I love telling stories. There are some truths that you can't tell in journalism. And actually in fiction, you can. And in fact, actually, I think what I've done writing is truer than a lot of my journalism. There's a deeper psychological truth that, I mean, you know, I'm not writing literature, you know, these are spy thrillers. It's not like, you know, it's just not even, never mind Dostoevsky. This isn't even John le Carré, right? Nowhere near it. But my central character, Max Mclean, who's an Anglo-Irish assassin who works for the British government, is a very violent, complicated man who is trying very hard to stay on the right side of the moral equation. He knows he started off doing something out of a sense of duty and honor and service. And he knows that he's become a killer in the process. And he's trying to resolve for himself what it means to have that degree of self-awareness and know what he's becoming, what he's become, and yet continue trying to do the thing that he originally signed up for. Mm. And what happens when you disobey orders? What happens when you go off on your own? You know, it's the flap of the butterfly's wing. Mm-hmm. By the end of the book, has created a hurricane. And, you know, will he survive it? So, you know, it's really, I hope people have the first one is the break line. The second one is Archangel. The first one gets a bit crypto pseudoscience. Archangel is more of a kind of traditional thriller narrative, but with a good dose of mysticism mixed in.
Right.
And, you know, again, you know, the things that interest me are in Archangel, one of the characters truly believed something which is happening is a mystical experience. But looked at from the outside, you can see very clearly that the explanation is scientific. Mm. But who's right? Mm. And ultimately, does it matter? Mm. Because the consequences and the implications are the same. So it's that sort of, you know, also a battle with memory of trying to remember who you are. So I've read an interesting writer recently who said that in the Christian context, the purpose of the priest is to help the congregation to remember the future. And I think that's, if your themes are about memory and survival, then as a writer, what you are trying to do is to help your readers through your characters remember the future. I could just leave it at that.
No, that's a beautiful place to stop. I'll wrap this up. Thank you so much for your time, man. I've really enjoyed it, and I'll wrap it up where I actually had planned to start, and then I forgot because we went off on something else, talking about Carry On films or something. I had a girlfriend when I was about 16, and I remember her older sister saying to her, "How can you go out with him? He's so obviously fucked up." Because I'm not someone who's ever been able to hide what's going on inside. And in looking at some of the photos, there's in particular, I think one that Tim took of you in Liberia, kind of hiding behind a wall.
Oh yeah.
And there's another one where you've got a similar look on your face, and you're talking about authenticity. It's all there. You're clearly one of those people. You know, you don't hide that. You know, I'm sure you keep stuff private. We all keep stuff private, but I really appreciate that about the work of yours that I've read, and this conversation in itself as well. There's a beautiful transparency and honesty, and I think that's what the world really lacks at the moment. You know, and you know, I was tempted, and I thought, no, let's not go down that path. I was tempted to go into the whole kind of fake news thing, and you know, what is journalism anymore? But you are one of the ones that when I look around, someone posted the thing about Trump yesterday getting COVID, and I immediately thought it was a spoof thing. And then I thought, I don't fucking know what's true anymore. That's something that has died. And when I talk to you, it's refreshing because it's like, oh God, at least we're in a space where we can talk whatever we feel the truth is. I've actually got quite a lot of tattoos. The first one I had on my arm is attributed to the godfather of the Ashashin cult, the original suicide bomber, I suppose, who's apparently his last words were, "Nothing is true, everything is permitted." So let's just leave it there.
Do what thou wilt. This shall be the whole of the law. Love under the law.
That's on this arm.
All right.
Thank you, man. I hope your weekend's restful and next week's not too mad. And I hope we get to talk again. I really appreciate you taking the time. It's been really, really
It's been
good.
a pleasure. I've really enjoyed it.
As is often the case, I feel very moved. There was some very, very powerful, very honest stuff that was going on in that conversation. So I'm hugely grateful to James for taking some time to talk to me, and hopefully we'll get him on the show again at some point in the future. As ever, I can't stress enough just how important it is if you did like the show, if you can give us 5 stars, if you can follow it, if you can give us a review, that'd be even better. And I'll keep doing them anyway, because it's just a pleasure for me to have these conversations and really sit and get into it with people without it being therapy, which is obviously my day job. I also love. As ever, huge thanks to the musicians who produced, performed, recorded, gave their time to create the soundtrack. Nick Van Gelder, Kenny Dickinson, Noel Langley, and the amazing Sian O'Gorman, who always blows my mind. All of them do. And thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next show. Bye then.